If you like these videos, please check out my full course at www.lsat.totaltestprep.net with tons of clearly explained actual LSAT questions written by someone who's mastered test and helped others master it, and an evaluation period where you only pay if you want to continue.
Okay, in this video, we're going to finish up with the conditional logic basics for verbal reasoning. So, once again, what is conditional reasoning? What is conditional logic? What is the nature of conditional logic? How do these statements appear in the test? And what do we not know on the basis of conditional statements? So, looking at conditional logic, the first thing to remember is that not all additional information is helpful. Remember, conditional logic basically functions on the test in the form of rules and additional information that, once combined with the rules, allows you to do something. But not all additional information will actually help you to do anything. Specifically, one of the first things is that you have to keep in mind that the sufficient, or the if condition, the activation to the rule, isn't necessary. What that means is it doesn't always have to be there. So for example, take a look once again at this rule. It says that if you live in New York City, then you live in the United States. And we know that Jane does not live in New York City. Can we conclude that Jane does not live in the United States? In other words, we know that if she lived in New York City, we know for a fact that she would live in the United States, because that would activate the rule. That's the sufficient condition. That means it's enough. That's all we need to know in order to know that the necessary condition, or the then condition, has to be true. But if it's not true, does that mean, or rather, if the sufficient condition is not true, if it's not true that she lives in New York City, then can we say, well, it's not true that she doesn't live in the United States? In other words, does it also have to be necessary? Does the sufficient have to be necessary? Does it have to be there? So if we don't have it, we can't have the other one? Well, obviously not. I mean, we know just intuitively and obviously looking at this that if somebody does not live in New York City, that doesn't necessarily mean that they don't live in the United States. The conditional statements only apply as rules if the sufficient condition is true. In other words, if the activator is true and if the rule is activated, that is when they only apply as rules. If you know that the rule has not been activated, you could still have the necessary. You could still have a situation where the necessary condition is true, because some other rule with the same consequence could have been activated, for example. So maybe if you live in California, you live in the United States. Maybe you live in Texas, you live in the United States. Maybe if you live in Florida, you live in the United States. Just because this particular conditional statement, this particular rule has not been activated, the sufficient isn't true, does not mean that we are not going to get that consequence. We don't know. There could be other rules which lead to the same consequence, which may have been activated. So you have to remember, just because something isn't true doesn't mean that, just because the sufficient is not true doesn't mean the necessary is false. You could have a situation where the sufficient is false and the necessary is true. Now, in this particular case, this is a little bit more straightforward because it's more obvious that if you live in New York City, you live in the United States. I just want to finish up. In other words, you cannot simply take the conditional rule and assume that if you negate both sides, that also has to be a valid rule. What I mean by that, you can't simply just negate the two elements for the reasons that I just said. If you live in New York City, then you live in the United States. But you don't know anything about what happens if you don't live in New York City. Just because if you don't live in New York City does not necessarily mean that you do not live in the United States. This is called a false negation. Taking the conditional rule and simply negating the two sides is what's called a false negation. You cannot simply negate the two sides. And you want to be very careful because they will use this in a lot of different ways, in a lot of different situations of the test. And I'll point it out. I'll bring it up. I'll point it out as we get to it in the different lessons. But this is one of the key ways in which they try to trick you with conditional reasoning. They give you a statement, which is a conditional rule, and then they count on you to simply infer that you can simply negate both sides, and that's a valid deduction. It's not. Sometimes it is, but most of the times it's not. So you can't do it. You can't assume that you can always do it. Now, as I mentioned, uh, the conditional rule we just went through, living in New York and living in the US, is fairly obvious. What tends to be a little tricky is when they give you these kinds of causal relationships. So that was a constitutive relation. So they'll give you a causal relationship, something like if you study for the LSAT, you're going to improve your score. And then they say Jane didn't study for the LSAT. The problem with that is that most students will immediately think of it in terms of their everyday context and say, well, if somebody doesn't study, they're not going to improve their score. But notice what you're doing there. What you're doing is you're assuming that you can critically evaluate that conditional statement. You're saying, well, it's not necessarily true that if somebody studies for the LSAT, they improve their score. And that's what I want you to be careful with. A lot of times you simply take, as I mentioned in the previous videos, you simply take the conditional statement as given. You take the rule as given. So you know that for a fact, if somebody studies for the LSAT, they're going to improve their score. So if they tell you Jane did not study for the LSAT, and then they ask you, well, can you conclude that she did not improve your score? If you start telling yourself and coming up with counterexamples, well, I know this person who studied and didn't study and didn't improve. I know this other person. What you're doing is you're looking at that causal relationship and you're challenging or you're critically evaluating the rule that they gave you. But you have to take it as given. And the same logic applies. We have no idea if she did not improve her score. Why? For the same exact reason, that just because the sufficient is false does not necessarily mean that the necessary is false. There could be other rules which were activated which led to the necessary. Maybe she cheated. So there's rule, for example, if you cheat, you can improve your score. If you guess, you can improve your score. If you just happen to have a really good day with no stress, you're going to improve your score. You're on top of everything. So maybe one of those things happened and she ended up improving her score. The fact that studying the LSAT is inevitably going to get you to improve your score according to the rule here and get taken as a given, and that's how once you do it in the test, does not necessarily mean that if you didn't do that, you're not going to get a score improvement. Maybe you did something else. The logic is exactly the same. It's a rule. If the rule is not activated, some other rule may have been activated, so you can't say that the consequence didn't happen. Okay, so this is the first thing. This is a situation where they're going to try and trick you by making you think that the sufficient is also necessary. So in other words, if the sufficient's not there, the necessary can't be there either. But that doesn't necessarily work. That's not necessarily the case. And so you can't make that false negation. You can't assume that just because you're given a rule, if you negate both sides, you'll be able to infer a rule which is like that, which has both sides negated. Okay. The other major thing is when they tell you, when they have you assume that the necessary is also sufficient. So you can't assume that. That additional information that the necessary is sufficient isn't necessarily true. What do I mean by that? So if we once again look at this specific rule, look at this particular rule we've been working with. If you live in New York City, that means you live in the United States. Well, I know Jane lives in the United States. So can I say that Jane lives in New York City? Well, once again, obviously not. Well, why not? Well, for the same reason. Conditional statements only apply as rules if the sufficient condition is true, if the rule is activated. Now, if you know that the consequence of the rule is true, so if the consequence is true, that does not mean that the rule has been activated. Once again, maybe some other rule with the same consequence has been activated, and that's kind of intuitively and obviously what's going on here. Once again, there's other rules. If you live in California, you live in the United States. If you live in Texas, you live in the United States. If you live in Florida, you live in the United States. So just because Jane lives in the United States, just because you know that this part is true, you don't necessarily know that the NYC part is true. Maybe she lives in California or in Texas or in Florida. So any one of these things could be true, which would also mean she lives in the United States. So just because she lives in the United States does not necessarily mean she lives in New York City. In other words, visually, you can't go backwards from the arrow. So you can definitely have a situation where the necessary is true and the sufficient is false. Because remember, all the conditional rule says is if the sufficient is true, the necessary has to be true. But that doesn't tell you what happens if the sufficient is false. So it's similar to the previous one. It's just a slightly different way of looking at it. If the necessary is true, you don't know anything about the sufficient. If you know that you've got the consequence of a particular rule, that does not necessarily mean that that particular rule is activated, because there could be other rules with the same consequence. Living in the United States, yes, if you live in New York City, that rule is activated, which means you have to live in the United States. But if you live in the United States, maybe some other rule is activated, which, living in California means that you live in the United States. Maybe that was activated, so you don't know that the person who lives in the US necessarily lives in New York City. And in other words, you cannot simply, and this is the same thing as with the previous one, with what we did in a couple of minutes ago, you can't simply take a conditional rule and assume that if you reverse the two sides, it also has to be a valid rule. So if you live in the United States, if you live in New York City, that means that you live in the United States. Can you simply then take this conditional and say, well, let's just flip it around and that's a valid rule as well? Does that, if this one is true, is this one, if the top one is true, does that mean that the bottom one, that if you live in the United States, then you live in New York City, is true? Obviously not. And the reason for that is because that is what it's called a false reversal. So like the false negation, where you take a conditional statement and you simply negate the two sides, that doesn't work. Same thing here. If you take a conditional statement and you simply reverse the two sides, that doesn't work either, for the same reason that I said, that the necessary condition has to be there if the sufficient condition is true. But if the necessary is true, it does not necessarily mean, it doesn't always mean that that specific sufficient condition that you have in your rule is what led to it. Some other sufficient condition could have led to it. And in this particular case, this is obvious, once again, just because it's more intuitively obvious that we're dealing with, if you live in New York City, that means you live in the United States. We all recognize that if you live in the United States, that does not necessarily mean you live in New York City. There's other places in the United States. Where they're going to try and trick you is, once again, with these more causal relationships, because we are sort of conditioned by the way we think about it, by the way we've been taught to think about it a certain way. So we have this rule: if you study for the LSAT, then you're going to improve your score. And then we're told that Jane improved her score. Can we say that Jane studied for the LSAT? And most students will intuitively start saying, well, yes, because studying for the LSAT leads to improving your score. One is a cause, one is an effect. Well, we have the effect. That means we must have had the cause that led to it. Once again, not necessarily, because there's other things that could lead to that effect. So just because you're told that you have the effect, which is the same thing as a necessary condition, it is not necessarily that specific cause or that specific sufficient condition that led to it. There could be other scenarios. So if you cheat, you're going to improve your score. If you guess, you're going to improve your score. If you have a day with no stress, you're going to improve your score. Maybe one of those causal factors led to Jane improving her score. We don't know. Okay? So this, like I said, this tends to be a little bit trickier just because it involves causal reasoning, which we've been conditioned to think a different way, but the logic is exactly the same. When you're given a conditional rule and you're told that the necessary is true, you cannot assume that it's because of the specific sufficient condition from that rule. The reason you can't assume that is because there might have been another rule which led to it. The reason for that is because all that a conditional relationship tells you is that whenever you have a rule and the rule is activated, in other words, the sufficient is true, the necessary has to be true. You don't know what happens if the sufficient is not true. You don't know what happens if the necessary is true. Okay, so summarize. If the sufficient condition is false, we don't know anything about the necessary condition. We can have a situation where the sufficient is false, but the necessary is true. And if the necessary condition is true, we don't know anything about the sufficient. Once again, we can have a situation where the necessary is true, but the sufficient is false. So the top one, where the sufficient is false, is the way they'll try to trick you is with the false negation. Well, they make you think that a conditional statement you can simply negate both of them and it's the same thing. That doesn't work. And in the bottom one, where the necessary condition is true, that's the way they try to trick you there is with a false reversal, where they give you a conditional statement and expect you to make the mistake that you can simply reverse the two conditions and everything is true. That's not the case. Okay, so with this lesson, we've finished up the videos and the sections for lesson 1 for verbal reasoning. So this is the basics. These are the basics of the verbal reasoning, the basic elements that you need to understand verbal reasoning on the test, specifically in the reading comprehension and in the arguments. And as we do the lessons as we do the sections in those lessons for the reading comprehension, for the arguments, we're going to go into more detail with the things that we've covered basically in this lesson in these sections.